Well, thank you very much and good morning. And I'd just like to start by just thinking of the people in Dunedin at the moment who are dealing with the flooding events down there, and that is exactly why this bill is just so important. Those kind of flooding events will only be made worse and more frequent as a result of climate change. South Dunedin is particularly vulnerable. And this bill, which is designed to increase greenhouse gas emissions, will result in those people and people like them all around the planet suffering more flooding events. So this bill is very problematic if you've got a concern for people in Dunedin. So there's in my submission I went through the 6 particular problematic areas, and so I'll just run through those briefly before opening up for questions or comments. So the first is around climate change itself. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has made it very clear that we can't afford to look for more fossil fuels if we want to avoid 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. This has been repeated by the International Energy Agency, which is the premier energy agency internationally, which has said if we want to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming, we can't exploit more fossil fuel reserves. It's updated that report in September last year and said, in fact, the existing fossil fuel infrastructure, we can't use everything we've got if we're going to avoid catastrophic climate change. So a bill like this, which is looking for more fossil fuel reserves, is a bill that's designed to make climate change much worse. And the key evidence for that comes from the key bodies we rely on, the key scientific bodies, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency. And so in a government whose coalition agreement says that it should be evidence-based decision-making, the evidence is compelling that this bill is completely against the evidence if you've got a concern about avoiding catastrophic climate change. The second issue is international commitment. Climate change is a global issue, so the solutions have to be global. They require an international agreements between different countries in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. We can't do it ourselves. And those international agreements are in the form of the Paris Climate Agreement, they're in the free trade agreements we've signed, some of the Pacific Island Forum statements we've agreed to. And as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said in the redacted part of its regulatory impact statement, this bill breaches those agreements. So this is a bill which breaches the European Union Free Trade Agreement. Now, the Ministry says it's unlikely the EU will take action against New Zealand under the Free Trade Agreement, but that's yet to be determined. Many countries in Europe take climate change very seriously. The European Union takes climate change very seriously. So the fact that New Zealand is breaching the European Union-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement by the passage of this bill, according to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, is an extremely serious problem. And it also undermines the international efforts to reduce climate change, which we depend on, because we can't solve it ourselves. It requires international cooperation. The third area is the seismic blasting impacts. So when you look for oil, they use this seismic blasting, which has dramatically detrimental effects on marine animals, particularly marine mammals, as we've seen in the past. So just that, the looking for the oil is a huge problem. Then there's the oil spills. We know that the exploratory drilling is the most dangerous phase of all, which is what happened with Deepwater Horizon in the United States. It was an exploratory well. When you first drill into fossil fuel reserves, you just don't know the pressure they're at, and that's when the oil spills are most likely, and that's exactly what happened. And so the oil spill event, if it were to happen off the coast of New Zealand, would have dramatic consequences in terms of our coastline and marine environment. The fifth point is around the liability. As the previous submitter pointed to, the change in liability means that taxpayers are going to be having to foot the bill. So Cameron cost us $443 million to clean up that mess. This bill is going to basically make it more likely that we'll have to pay huge amounts to clean up mess in the future by weakening the provisions around liability. But the sixth area, and perhaps in some ways the most important, is that New Zealand does have a real world energy challenge. So aside from the kind of virtue signalling of this bill, this kind of far right virtue signalling that's in this bill, there's actually a real world energy challenge, which is the transition towards clean energy. And fortunately, there's serious people who are doing serious work on this problem. So the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment put out its electricity demand and supply projections just in July this year. So they looked at the projections through to 2050. And what they did is they assumed large-scale electrification of vehicles, they assumed electrification of industrial processes, and then they asked themselves the question, well, how are we going to meet the need for more electricity? And so there's a huge growth in wind, a huge growth in solar and storage. There's no need for fossil gas. It becomes a very marginal fuel. It doesn't contribute significantly to the projections. So if you read the actual reports from the people whose job it is to figure out how we make this energy transition in the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, this bill is irrelevant. And as their advice says, the best that will reduce gas in the New Zealand system in 2035, and that's assuming there's a company that looks for oil and assumes that they find oil. The best you get is 2035. By then, we already have to deal with the energy transition. This is the problem we have right now. Transpower did similar modelling in 2019 about the energy transition we face and came to similar conclusions. We need lots more renewable wind and solar and storage, and fossil gas is completely marginal. So this bill is a distraction, in fact, to the real world challenge that adults have to deal with. And the adults in the room have to deal with the energy transition New Zealand needs to make. And this bill makes no contribution to it. It's a distraction from it. So that's really the guts of it. And I'm very happy to have any questions that people have in the last few minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Norman. We have a question from Steve Evan.
Thank you, Dr. Norman. I wonder, in your time, you've watched various political positions around the climate, and subsequent governments have taken positions. An earlier submitter described the current one as embarrassing and regressive. Does it, in a sense, look like we are cancelling that transition you talk of by our failure to electrify transport, by our failure to phase out fossil fuels, the failure of this government to properly support that necessary big increase in solar and wind? And how regressive and how embarrassing is this for us as a nation in terms of our reputation in that global challenge of climate change?
I mean, I think when because I met with the EU ambassador a couple of weeks ago to discuss exactly these issues, and obviously there is concern around the world about the position that the current New Zealand government is taking on climate change, the step backward that it's taking. I'm sure it's going to come up in the European Union in the next months because as the commissioners have hearings before the European Parliament, the position of New Zealand is a problem for the European Union. They just signed this free trade agreement with us, which is this free trade agreement got through the European Parliament with the biggest majority of any free trade agreement, primarily because of the environment chapter and the Indigenous rights chapter in the free trade agreement. So for New Zealand to completely reverse and break the environment chapter of the free trade agreement is problematic for the European Union. In terms of our other big trading partners, China is looking to have peak greenhouse gas emissions 5 years ahead of its promise. So probably this year or next year, it promised to have peak emissions by 2030. So China's taking climate change extremely seriously. The United States, the only wild card there, is the only thing that can save Luxon is if Trump's elected, I guess, then the United States has a climate denying government like the New Zealand government. But if that doesn't happen, then New Zealand's going to be very isolated in the United States as well. So yeah, it is a big problem for us globally to have such a revisionist position. It's not going to stop the clean energy transition because solar is still the cheapest, wind is still far cheaper than gas and coal. Gas and coal is so terribly expensive. So it's hard for gas and coal to really make progress against the cheaper renewables, but it will slow it down and make it much harder, just make it harder for New Zealand to make this transition. So I think the transition will definitely happen. This bill and the attempts to slow down the transition will have some effect, but they won't stop it.
All right, we have, Dr. Norman, you mentioned the EU ambassador and you mentioned that he's concerned about this legislation. So was it a verbal conversation or is there a correspondence in writing?
What I said was that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, in its advice to Parliament and the regulatory impact statement, said its view was that this bill was a breach of the European Union New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. What they said was that they didn't think that the European Union would take action against New Zealand, but what I'm saying is I wouldn't be so sure about that, because I've had conversations just recently with the EU ambassador about these issues, and then you've seen what happened in the European Parliament, why the European Parliament approved the free trade agreement with such a large majority was because of the environment chapter, which this bill breaches. So I just think that, you know, that there is a very high risk that New Zealand's position on climate change will become a focus of the European Union.
So you said in your response to Steve Ebel's question that in your conversation with him, he expressed concern. So I just want to confirm that part which you have just said here, because basically we would like that the fact is confirmed by you, and if needed, to be cross-checked.
And so what I said was that the European Union officials are concerned about New Zealand's position on climate change. I didn't discuss with them this, but I didn't say that they were concerned about this particular bill. The concern about this particular bill comes from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade Advice, which is your official advice.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Norman. And we have finished the time that was allocated for you. Thank you for your